I don't know whether you've seen that film of Michael Moore's where he sort of waddles around saying that life expectancy is lower here. Yeah, life expectancy may be lower for a whole bunch of reasons to do with street crime and so on. What actually matters is what are your chances once you have been diagnosed with a disease? And they are better. Anybody would rather fall ill here than in Britain. So you might say, well, then why do you keep this crazy system of yours? When it is so obviously not working, when it so obviously led to all of the things that we know socialism leads to corruption and to rationing and to inefficiency, why do we do it? And the answer is, once you have it, it is almost impossible to get rid of. The National Health Service is the third biggest employer in the world, after the Chinese Red Army and the Indian National Railway System. 1.4 million people work for the NHS. The overwhelming majority of those are administrators, managers. A minority are doctors and nurses. And yet, human nature being what it is, we are always more easily scared of the prospect of loss than we are enthused by the prospect of gain. And so people now feel trapped, almost like a battered wife, into sticking with what they know. And when, in a Fox interview a few weeks ago, I suggested that you would be making a mistake to follow us, within about 3 minutes, the British Health Minister was on television saying, "How dare Daniel Hannan attack our hard-working doctors and nurses?" Of course, I hadn't been attacking our hard-working doctors and nurses. Indeed, I hadn't even attacked any lazy doctors or nurses who were out there, which statistically presumably must exist. All I had said is that we might have a better way of doing it, but even that is considered unforgivable in the United Kingdom. Almost anything else you can get away with, All manner of sins and blasphemies shall be forgiven unto men, but the blasphemy against the Holy Ghost shall not be forgiven unto men. And the blasphemy against the Holy Ghost in the British context is to say anything critical of this massive employer because it has so many vested interests. So once you get this, my friends, you won't be able to get rid of it. It's all very well to say, oh, it'll just be, one more system that sits alongside all the private ones. That isn't how it will work in practice. You will end up where we are, with a state committee making decisions that are literally life and death decisions, decreeing which treatments, which medications can be made available on the system and which ones not. And that, if you wanted to think of the one thing that was most antithetical to the vision of your third president, you couldn't come up with something, a clearer example than a national state bureaucracy having this terrifying, awful power to decide who lives and who dies. Now, why do I come here as a British politician to hymn the praises of Thomas Jefferson? It may strike you as a curious thing to do. I think the answer is this. Go back to what he was writing at the time. Go back to what your patriot leaders were saying in the run-up to the revolution. Ignore all of the subsequent flag-waving histories of the independence war that portray it as a battle between two peoples, as indeed a war of independence, and look at what they were saying at the time. And what Jefferson and the other colonial leaders thought was not that they were revolutionaries, but that they were conservatives. In their own minds, they were simply defending what they had always assumed to be their rights as freeborn Englishmen against a tyrannical and innovative court. In their eyes, the revolutionaries were those seeking to unbalance the Constitution, and they were the defenders of traditional liberties. Which brings me to my country's tragedy, which I hope will not become yours. The grievances which Thomas Jefferson laid against George III, that laws were being passed unconstitutionally, that taxes were being levied without popular consent, that there had been a shift in power from the legislature to the executive. All of those things have now come true in my country. They didn't come true during the 1770s, they have come true since, as a result of European integration and the massive rise of the standing bureaucracy of the executive. And that's why I worry when I see the same thing beginning in your country. Because, British freedoms thrive here in a way that they don't thrive at home anymore. It's rather like those those varieties of grape that flourished in California when the phylloxera blight was wiping out the ancestral vines in Europe. My fathers took to the world, I think, our country's supreme export, our greatest gift to the happiness of mankind, namely the idea that laws should be passed only by elected representatives meeting in legislatures. We planted that seed here in the fertile soil of North America, and it has found root. But back in the home country, the ancestral vine is withering. And when I see the same tendencies here towards the aggrandizement of executive power, towards the reduction in the jurisdiction and freedom of action of the sovereign states, towards judicial activism, I think then our last hope is being snuffed out. The one place where British liberties survived, even there, they're under threat. So let me wind up where I started by saying the solution lies in this room. The solution lies with you, state legislators, infused by the great mission statement of the American Legislative Exchange Council. What was it, ultimately, that pushed Jefferson and the other leaders into action? It was a burgeoning state. It was high taxes. It was an oppressive government that didn't recognize limitations on its power. And when you are faced with similar tendencies today, it's from you, the Jeffersonians of today, that the solution will come. Because the strongest defense against an overmighty state and against the engorgement of the budgets that go with that is the dispersal of power. You all know at first hand that within a state, or even more within a county, where there is proximity to the electorate, where there is a manageable size, you do not have the duplications and the inefficiencies and the massive standing bureaucracies that you get when government becomes distant and remote. And now, when you are faced with this increase in powers of the White House in a way not seen since Roosevelt's era, the solution again must come from you, from the state legislators, from ALEC. Bring the power closer to the people, and you will make government more efficient, and better value for money, and more democratic. Before the revolution came, Jefferson wrote that there would be a massive movement of population across the Atlantic from east to west. And he confidently asserted that there would be very few people making the return journey. Well, how spectacularly that came true in a way that he couldn't have foreseen. But on what was his confidence based? He was a patriot, certainly. But he didn't think that there was some unique property in American soil or American weather or the American gene pool that would make this country such an attractive destination. Rather, he thought that the most important aspect of American civilization was the system of government. And he was firmly convinced that if other countries copied that form of government, they too could share in the fruits of liberty. And again, how spectacularly that came true. And that's why when we see those liberties under threat here, it isn't just your problem. It's the world's problem. You're exactly what your Pilgrim Fathers saw, the city on the hill. You're the inspiration for the rest of us. And when we look at this country and we see that even here, the principles of limited government and free markets and individual liberty are in retreat, then truly we see that those principles are in danger throughout the world. And so let me close by asking you to believe in yourselves, to lead the world by your experience and your example, to dare mighty deeds. Let me close with a heartfelt plea from a British legislator who loves his country to American legislators who still believe in theirs. Honor the vision of your third president. Respect the most sublime constitution drafted by human intelligence. Never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part.